Our next contestant on Scientific Idol, Jamshed Bharucha, does not just have an awesome name. He also conducts research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience, focusing on the cognitive and neural basis of the perception of music at Tufts University. Anybody need to applaud Tufts? Okay. Oh, okay. He's a provost and senior vice president of Tufts. As its chief academic officer, he's in charge of the education and research missions of the university. He's the past editor of the interdisciplinary journal Music Perception. And as you will witness shortly, he is a violinist. Please help me welcome Jamshed Bharucha.
Thank you. Well, once upon a time, I was an honest professor before I crossed over to the dark side of university administration and became a dean and then the provost. And now, when you do that, your colleagues, they wonder why you would do such a thing. From going from the perfect, idyllic life of teaching and research to administration. And so there are usually two hypotheses that faculty members advance for why one of their own would do that. One is that your brain is dead, you've gone brain dead. And the other is that you've run out of ideas, and so you've gone over to the dark side. And while your brain is not yet dead, it will soon become dead. So I was, of course, immediately on the defensive, and so I had a MRI brain scan done. This was the before scan, just before I moved into administration. And I'd like to show you my first MRI brain scan. So this is it. And as you see from the top left to the bottom right, it's really, I'm looking this way. Those are slices going left to right of my brain. And I was, of course, very relieved to see that all the right parts were there. Based on what I had learned as an undergraduate in neurobiology. Although some of my colleagues still argue that the frontal lobes look a bit shrunken in this image. And so I get an annual brain MRI scan just to show that the brain does not continue to shrink, or there are no dead parts in it. Now, as part of that initial experiment, I decided I would listen to music because I've been studying music for most of my career, but MRI had become a new technology at the time. I decided, why not listen to music and track the brain activity while I listen to music, which is called functional MRI, sometimes abbreviated fMRI. When you go into the doctor's office and you get an MRI because they suspect a tumor or there's brain damage, that's an anatomical or a structural MRI, and that shows the tissue contours. But then you can reprogram the machine to actually track blood flow in the brain so that you can see which parts of your brain are active. So as I speak to you now, I'm actually influencing your brains in many, many ways, but in one particular way, unless you're asleep or have had too much alcohol, the parts of your brain that are responsible for comprehending speech ought to be pretty active. And they are roughly around where you see the green circle there. That part of the brain is called the Heschel's gyrus, or the superior temporal gyrus, which is right about there. So I was, again, pretty relieved to see that while I was listening to music, this part was active, even though we actually didn't know from human studies before this that this would be active in humans, but from animal studies, this had been thought to be the case. Now, what I discovered about myself is our moderator talked about your left brain and your right brain. If you look at the equivalent slice on the right side, which would be something like this, you see the superior temporal gyrus there, no activity at all. So for me, the activity as I listen to music in the part of the brain that processes sound, or pitch in particular, is limited to the left side and almost none on the right side. Now, that's not true of the general public. If you scan most people, you'll see bilateral activation in the superior temporal gyrus with a little bit of a rightward asymmetry. But the old notion that somehow language is on the left and music is on the right of the brain is not true. It's much more complicated than that. Now, it turns out that there are many other parts of my brain that got activated. The cerebellum here, which is responsible for timing and all kinds of interesting things, and that shouldn't be a surprise for music. But also, for those of you who are neuroscientists, you might recognize that some parts of the motor cortex of the brain are also active. So it turns out that when you listen to music, the part of the brain that's responsible for driving movement gets activated. And so perception is not just a passive process of listening, but in fact activates your body. And which is why it's no surprise that music is related to dance. In fact, in most cultures, music is accompanied by movement or dance. It's really only in Western music, it's actually only Western classical music where you're taught to sit in your seat and not move at all. What's happening there is the brain is trying to move, but then the cortex is saying, no, it's not appropriate, and it really inhibits the rest of the brain. So it's rather stressful. But in most other forms of music, including Indian classical music, the audience is encouraged to move in certain kinds of ways. In another study that was published in Science with my postdoc, Peter Janata, who is now at UC Davis, we looked at perception of music, and this shows different angles of viewing the brain. The superior temporal gyrus that I mentioned, at this angle you can see over there, and you can see bilateral activation. So this is the average of a number of different volunteers. It's not me anymore. But if you look at the brain from the front, you see this activation right where I've circled it there, the prefrontal cortex, right up there between the eyes. You get that kind of activation when you present changes in harmony. So the brain actually has encoded, through a lifetime of exposure to relationships between keys and chords, encoded those relationships right here in the prefrontal cortex. So the superior temporal gyrus responds to pitch and pitch patterns per se, but the prefrontal cortex is really where some of this, the musical structure, harmonic structure, is encoded. Which raises the question, is that specific to Western music? Is it just about Western keys? If you played music from other cultures, would you see different patterns of activation? So we did a study. It's not published yet, but it's a preliminary study because I have this day job of being provost at the university. You know, I don't get to do research full time as some of my colleagues here do. But I'll just illustrate a few of the differences between Indian and Western modes just by playing some scales. I don't get a lot of time to practice. I'm not going to play anything fancy. And then I'll tell you a little bit about this study. So Western music today is characterized mostly by the major and minor modes. The major mode goes like this. But in some parts of the world, such as India or Arab countries, you have many, many other modes. In India, you have probably 100 modes, but maybe at least 10 of them that are used quite often. And one, let me just play you one, that ought to sound foreign, sound sort of Eastern, called Pyros. So you wouldn't often hear this in the Western context. And if you grow up in a place like India and you hear it a lot, the brain is going to learn that pattern so that when you're at a performance and somebody plays a piece in that raga, in this case Bhairav, the brain recognizes the underlying structures and starts to generate expectations for what you would expect. And so the key to the aesthetics of music is for the composer and the performer to generate those expectations that are culturally based and then to violate them to varying degrees, fulfill or violate them to varying degrees. And so if you're not familiar with the underlying structure, there are no expectations, and so there are no expectations to violate. And so you would expect to see different patterns of activation in the brain if you were presenting music from one culture or another. Let me just play just a very short raga based on this mode, which is called Bhairav. So I'll play the mode again. Now, in the raga is a more complex pattern based on the mode. You can, it does take some liberties, so that some of the musicians here will notice that. But I'll just play you a short raga. So somebody who's grown up in India might start to generate those kinds of expectations, and you wouldn't find them in a Western listener. So the hypothesis of this experiment using a functional MRI was to put people in an MRI machine who'd grown up in the United States or grown up in India. And in this case, these were Dartmouth undergraduates where I used to teach. And so we selected students who had grown up in the United States versus students who had grown up in India. Of course, the ones who grew up in India were currently studying in the United States, so they also had the Western background. So in some sense, the Indian students were bicultural and bilingual, and the American students were monocultural, which there's a little story I like to tell about that. In the old days, if you wanted to do a cross-cultural study in psychology or anthropology, you had to go and find some remote tribe somewhere in New Guinea that had never been exposed to the rest of the world, was sort of isolated. Well, today you can't find those tribes because of technology and TV and so on, internet and so on and so forth, because everybody's bombarded with these Western musical patterns. So the only place that's isolated enough to do cross-cultural research is right here in the United States, because people really haven't heard much of the musics of other cultures. So we didn't have to get a grant to go off, and go camping somewhere else. We did it right here. We didn't have to find an MRI machine. Our American subjects were appropriately, their brains were sort of virgin brains, had really never, had not been tainted by perceptions of the Indian. We were able to verify that. Anyway, so they're in the MRI machine, lying there, and we play them patterns of Western classical music, Indian classical music, Western pop music, Indian pop music, some English, fluent English, and fluent Hindi, and some environmentally neutral sounds like car horns and things like that. And then we scan their brains. Now, for language, for English versus Hindi, we got a whopping cross-cultural effect in terms of brain activation, such that the activation patterns in the temporal lobe of the brain, which contains the superior temporal gyrus, they were much more extensive in response to English than in response to Hindi. Even though they engaged similar areas, the extent of engagement activation was much greater for the familiar language than for the unfamiliar language. Huge, huge, huge effect. For the Indian subjects, however, we got no effect at all, and that's not surprising because the Indian subjects were actually fluent in both Hindi and English, so both languages engaged roughly the same extent of neural tissue in the temporal lobe. Now, for music, we couldn't find some clear cross-cultural effect the way we did for language, and so I wonder what's going on. Surely there has to be an effect, because when you listen to music from a culture that you're not familiar with, it does sound strange. It sounds different. There must be something different going on in the brain when you become familiar with patterns. So we thought maybe it's not a single region in the brain that characterizes those differences, but maybe there's some distributed pattern that collectively captures these cross-cultural differences. And so for each subject in the experiment, we calculated a mathematical vector, which is just an ordered list of numbers, that represent the extent of activation in 16 different brain regions. So I would end up with a vector, you would end up with a vector, you would end up with a vector, and then correlated each person's vector with each other person's vector to get a matrix of correlations between the brain patterns of all of the volunteer subjects. So the higher the correlation, the more similar the activation. Say the higher the correlation between our vectors, the more similar the activation patterns of our brain, and so on and so forth. And then used that set of correlations to create a space, a mathematical space, in which we were able to project the individual subjects. It's sort of like taking a table of intercity distances between all pairs of cities in the United States, the mileages, and trying to create a map of the United States out of that, okay, which shows where the cities are. It's called multidimensional scaling. And alas, not alas, but fortunately what happened was the subjects nicely segregated themselves in that space so that the Indian subjects and the American subjects formed two distinct clusters. So cultural space maps onto brain space through a process of being acculturated or immersed in that culture. Now let me end with a slightly different angle. What's music all about? If you ask somebody, just pull somebody off the street, or if I were to ask you, what's the one word that comes to mind when you think of music? Just quickly, one word. What do you think of? Emotion. Yeah, emotion. Now, if you're trained in classical music, particularly Western classical music, you're usually taught to kind of stay away from that word for a long time because you're trained about the structure and so on. But if you ask somebody who's not that trained, you get this word emotion. So music clearly has the capacity to communicate emotion. Now, a very interesting area of research just over the last few years has developed to try and understand the relationship between music and speech. Both use pitch patterns, both use rhythmic patterns, both use timbral patterns. And I think evolutionarily, it's got to be the case that music derives from pre-linguistic forms of vocal communication, such as animals use, and that language today would have also derived from some of those same origins. And so it wouldn't be surprising if you found some parallels. The reason it's difficult to study those parallels, and it's difficult to develop hypotheses and intuitions about those parallels, is that when you listen to somebody speaking in a way that you speak, in your own, with your own sort of linguistic subcommunity, you don't pay attention to the sound patterns very much at all. The meaning pops into your head. The brain processes the sound as a sound code, offers up the meaning, and you go with that. It's only when somebody speaks a little bit differently, you call that an accent, that you actually notice some of the sound patterns. And when you hear a foreign language that you're not familiar with, all you hear is the sound pattern because you don't get any meaning. So you really need to analyze the sound signal to really see what's in it. And fortunately, we have some algorithms today, computer algorithms, that enable us to do that very well. So a former student of mine, Megan Curtis, who just got a job, academic job, I'm very happy in this economy, very difficult. She had this hypothesis that in normal emotional speech, emotions are coded in the patterns of pitch in similar ways to the way they might be coded in music. Initially, I thought, it's a risky dissertation project, blah, 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 blah. Don't do it. Too ambitious, too risky. Turned out actually to be quite interesting. So we have a paper coming out right now that shows the following. So she invited actresses into the lab to speak with different kinds of emotions, and sadness, anger, pleasantness, and happiness. And two of them are positive emotions, two are negative, two are high energy, two are low energy. And they were asked to speak various neutral bisyllabic utterances like okay, hello. And then we analyzed the pitch patterns and projected them onto musical intervals and found that for sadness, most of the bisyllabic utterances were either descending minor thirds or one or two semitones greater or less than that. So the distribution of musical intervals was very much focused on descending minor thirds. For those of you who are not musicians, I'll just play descending minor third. That would be sadness. Okay? And then for anger, we found it was a bimodal distribution, the ascending minor second and the ascending tritone. So the ascending minor second would be, and the ascending tritone would be. So those two emotions had an intervallic signature, and the two positive emotions had no intervallic signature. And so we suspect that's because in the course of evolution, it's very important to be able to communicate negative emotion because you better get it quickly because you might be in danger, whereas that same kind of cost doesn't occur with positive emotion. Thank you.